Hi, Max here. No, I thought I was online earlier, but technology screwed me, as it so often does. So now I've got to assure I got a connection. All right, I got a connection. Boy, if it wasn't for the need, I wouldn't have anything in my house any more high tech than a wired dial-up telephone. All these computers and gadgets. Look at my screen, okay? You see a tube television set, turn it on, change the channel, there you go. It's not smart. It doesn't jump around the world saying, look, you can watch Amazon. It doesn't do that. What you see is simple. My mixing board. That is also analog. And my Canon, about as analog as it comes, baby. All right, let's talk about The Darkening. This is an amazing book. Chapter 8, A Hero Rises, Rounding Up the Commies. Senator Joseph McCarthy, he headed up the Committee on Un-American Activities, and he dug deep into the Hollywood motion picture and New York broadcast industry. These industries had been so thoroughly compromised by communists, they demanded attention. Moscow had successfully exploited the communist Jewish elements that controlled the mass media of Hollywood and New York. By this time, communist Jews owned and or controlled almost all motion picture houses, radio networks, television networks, magazines, print media. Jewish affections for communism, long festering in the American Jewish community, ran high. With their invaluable support, Soviet propaganda began to change the very hearts, the minds, the thoughts, the outlook, the values of the entire Western world. As with Jews worldwide, Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev were revered as heroes because they promoted the utopian dream of communism, which seems to be endemic to the Jewish faith. Like the spores of a noxious weed, spies and sympathizers were sown across the country. They scattered from sea to shining sea, border to border, north to south. Moscow had developed and coordinated a very well organized, a very highly effective propaganda machine. The Russian fifth column, which is what it was, it grew daily, and it grew quickly, and it fast became the greatest single threat to the freedom of the United States and the world. Let me take a second to explain to you what a fifth column is. Let me simplify it. They take a bunch of people and drop them into your country. Or they take people who are already here. But they insinuate themselves and assimilate with your population. They're spies working for Russia or China or Islam, waiting for the word from their leader to conduct sabotage, to conduct murder, to conduct espionage. They're a fifth column. They are so large and so secret. It could be 100 people, it could be 1,000,000 people. And in the case of the Soviet fifth column, we never knew. We never knew. This was a case where Americans faced an army of unknown size and effectiveness, living in their own backyard. This fifth column pretended to be typical Americans, but they lived secret lives. These camouflaged enemies were prepared to rise up on a large scale under the command of Moscow. Today, we have a different fifth column in our country, and that's radical Islam. Islam has planted hundreds of thousands of their soldiers in this country, waiting for the word from their imams. Yeah, they're out there, baby. Not all of them, but a whole bunch of them. Now, the communist fifth column, the communist fifth column of the 1950s and 60s was mostly populated by Eastern Europeans who had sneaked into the country. And, of course, there were Canadians who had sneaked into the country as well. They'd assimilated themselves and formed a fifth column. And American citizens who already lived there, people been there all their lives, but loved the idea of the communist utopia, the communist dream, the wonders of communism, they were there to help them as well. All stood ready to rise up with force of arms. They stood ready to fight to defeat America in the name of the deluded dream of communism. Their numbers never grew very large, at least never large enough to pose a viable threat, so they were never activated. Or were they? Huh? Many Americans believed the Hollywood and New York propagandists. We do today. If it's in a movie, it's probably based on truth. If it's on TV, of course it's true. If it's in the paper, of course it's true. We are idiots. We just let them slap us around with some of the most insane, salacious propaganda, and we say, oh, it's got to be true. They would never lie to me. Understand. So many people today hold the dream of a utopia delivered by communism in their hearts. Communist-owned mainstream media, as I said, radio, newsprint, blah, 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 continues to brainwash Americans. You want to find a brainwashed bunch of people? Go to a public school. Go to a government-paid school, high school, middle school. You'll find a bunch of them. We'll get into that a couple of chapters later. I'm going to chapter 9 now. A new player in the wings. Mao's China on the field. Now it's Beijing and no longer Moscow, which has assumed the position as spreader of lies and perpetrator of the communist plot. As it is today, major radio and television news commentators, reporters, actors, actresses, singers, and other performers have devoted themselves to the communist cause. Communist-aligned Jewish families own, they did then, they still now, they still own major television, major radio networks, metropolitan newspapers. They largely influence the motion picture industry, and they continue to create and spread propaganda like so much cow shit spread in a garden. These are the ilk of those whom Senator McCarthy targeted. Given their deep roots and the wide support of the gullible American public, McCarthy still had a long way to go to succeed in destroying the Soviet fifth column. Moscow's desire for conquest, it was originally tailored to a weakening America. But an increasing number of Americans sympathized with the myth of communism. Hey, Moscow said, wait a minute. We're planting our people, but a lot of Americans there right now can be swayed, can be converted very easily. Let's bring them on board. That empowers Moscow. Anti-war demonstrations against America's involvement in the Korean War were growing in size and frequency. During the Korean War, it was almost like Vietnam. We had more and more student sit-ins, public demonstrations, because we were in a war we didn't belong in. Truman stuck us in there, and he made a lot of money over the dead bodies of our boys and girls. Of course, the media softened coverage of civil disobedience that was sweeping the country. By softening it, nobody worries about it. The media just swept it under the rug. Keeping mainstream America in the dark was a sure way of delaying and softening public objection to a war that nobody wanted. This is what those people in the know said about the mainstream media in articles across the country. A typical quote: "They treat us like mushrooms. They keep us in the dark and feed us a lot of shit." End quote. That's where it comes from. America was a plum to be picked, and Moscow did the picking. In order for the grand scheme of Moscow to work, they needed a special weapon. They sought an issue. They needed an idea. They needed a handle. They needed a tool with which to exploit America's weaknesses. They began a search for that something special, that peculiar or particular weakness that would give them power over the individual American, not just society at large. That opportunity soon became obvious. The ideal tool to achieve this was America's dark past of Negro slavery. It was within the black-white world, had to turn the page, within that black-white world of slavery and slave history, that they found what they were looking for. What they found was shame, an emotion non-existent among communists and also lacking in the Negro population. The vast majority of Americans were Christians. It's long been the case where Christians, more than any other group, experience and spread shame. Using rewritten, refabricated, distorted, heavily propagandized Negro slave history, it was easy to break down and divide the American people. Moscow knew that Americans were easily shamed just by the mere mention of Negro slavery. They knew that millions of Americans were already struggling with the slave past of their country. Moscow was well aware that revising and rewriting America's Negro slave history would do even more damage than the atomic bomb. For this kind of war, all that was needed was a strike into the minds, into the souls of America. Specifically, they targeted the Negroes. More easily brainwashed and conditioned, the Negroid race was already prevalent among a predominantly non-Negro society. Like a ticking time bomb, they lived in small numbers scattered across the country, a force to be used when needed. An unwitting fifth column. Just think of it. As a phenomenon of the past, Negroes had a very high birth rate. Not anymore, but they did. Margaret Sanger fixed that. We'll talk about it later. It was this high rate of reproduction that also attracted communist authors. It was assumed that this birth rate would provide limitless young minds to brainwash and adjust to the communist ideal. They missed the target. Today, the birth rate of Negroes in America has fallen by over 80%, and more Negro infants are slaughtered in vitro than are born. Communists could not have predicted the work of Margaret Sanger, a woman bent on the eradication of the American Negro. The Planned Parenthood Corporation she founded led to the phenomenal rates of abortion among Negro women. By dividing a nation to weaken their unity of will, that nation is easily and eventually conquered. Certain divisions already existed in American society. So it was here, in the greatest fissure of divisive probability, that they found their ultimate weapon against America. The blacks inadvertently provided that silver bullet that Moscow had so desperately sought. Initially, Moscow took only casual notice of Joe McCarthy, viewing him as nothing more than a minor nuisance, a fly in their soup. Moscow considered his efforts unworthy of their time. To them, McCarthy was an insignificant little blurb, a radical with delusions of grandeur, and a consummate showboat. They were to be proved wrong. I close out chapter 9, people. What I'm reading you, I may not agree with all of it, but it makes a hell of a lot of sense. I'm Max. Tomorrow, open the book up. Yeah, tomorrow it's going to be chapter 10 and chapter 11. We'll talk to you then.